The USS Halcyon did not sleep. Even in the deepest hours of the night cycle when the main corridors dimmed to the shade of blue-gray that the station's designers had determined was psychologically optimal for a population that never saw natural darkness, the Halcyon breathed. It hummed through its floors and its walls and its reinforced structural members with the low continuous pulse of something enormous, staying alive by intention rather than instinct. 21 kilometers from bow to stern, 53,000 personnel distributed across residential rings, operational decks, research divisions, and the vast mechanical interior that kept all of it functioning without anyone particularly thinking about how. The station had been positioned at the outer edge of the Brennan Belt for 9 years. In that time, it had accumulated the specific personality that all large vessels eventually develop a sense of its own rhythms, its own temperatures, its own acoustics. There were corridors where sound traveled strangely, and corridors where it disappeared entirely. There were sections of the lower engineering decks where the recycled air carried a faint metallic undertone that nobody had ever successfully traced to a source, and sections of the upper residential rings where the atmospheric processors had been tuned over years of incremental adjustment to produce something that smelled almost like morning. Admiral Serena Voss had lived aboard the Halcyon for 6 years. She knew it the way you know a place you have stopped being a visitor to and started simply inhabiting. She knew the sound the primary power grid made during load rotation at the second hour of the night cycle. She knew which elevator in the command spire ran 3 seconds slow, and which conference room had a ventilation fault that made extended meetings in cold weather feel like a form of institutional punishment someone had designed deliberately. She was thinking about none of this as she guided her personal vessel through the Halcyon's secondary approach corridor at 2 in the morning. She was thinking about keeping her hands steady on the controls because her hands wanted very badly to shake, and she was not going to allow that. She was thinking about the approach angle because Bay 9 was a maintenance facility rather than a command berth, and the docking margins were tighter than she was accustomed to, and the port stabilizer on her ship was responding with a half-second lag that required constant correction. She was thinking about the scan frequency of the station's external sensor array and the 17-second window between sweeps that she had calculated correctly as it turned out would be sufficient to bring her through the secondary approach without appearing on the primary traffic log. She was not thinking about how close it had been. She had made a decision not to think about that yet. Later, when the ship was secured and she was alone in her quarters with the door locked, she would allow herself to think about it. Not now. Bay 9 was a secondary maintenance facility 2 levels below the primary flight deck. It handled routine servicing, long-term storage, and the kind of unglamorous upkeep work that kept a fleet operational without announcing itself. At 2 in the morning, it was empty of personnel and lit in the reduced mode that the station's power management system applied to unoccupied spaces. The shadows were long and the lighting was cool and functional, and the docking approach required Voss to rely on her instruments more than her eyes. The ship settled into the berth with a sound that was partly the mechanical engagement of the docking clamps and partly something she chose not to identify more precisely. She ran the shutdown sequence. The displays went dark in sequence, each one returning a status summary that she read and did not allow herself to react to. Port stabilizer compromised. Structural integrity of the forward section, 61% and degrading. Resonance coil assembly, collapsed housing output at 38% of operational minimum. Hull integrity across the starboard, NL fractures, consistent with high-velocity atmospheric transit at an angle significantly outside design parameters. She read it all. She closed the displays. She sat in the dark of the powered-down cockpit for approximately 90 seconds, which was as long as she could afford. Then she climbed out of the ship, crossed the empty hangar floor, and took the service elevator to the command level. She walked the corridor to her quarters with the measured pace of someone returning from a late working session, nodded to the single security officer she passed, and closed her door. She did not sleep. She sat at her desk in the dark and thought through the mathematics of her situation with the focused precision that had carried her through 30 years of decisions that did not have good options. Only options that were less bad than other options. The mission had been necessary. She believed this completely, and she believed it the same way she believed the structural specifications of the ships in her fleet, not because she wanted to, but because the evidence supported no other conclusion. The intelligence she had needed was in a location that no approved flight plan would have reached in the window available. The window mattered because the window was the difference between the information being current and the information being useless. She had made the call she had made, and she would make it again under the same circumstances. What she could not afford was for Joint Command to know she had made it. General Warren Aldrich had been working for the better part of 18 months to restructure the Outer Belt Command hierarchy in ways that would, when the restructuring was complete, leave the Halcyon's fleet operationally subordinate to a central command board rather than to its own admiral. The proposal was framed in the language of efficiency and unified strategic coordination, which was the language that military bureaucracies used when they wanted to consolidate authority without appearing to consolidate authority. Voss had read the proposal carefully. She understood exactly what it meant. So did everyone else who had read it carefully, which was a group that did not include most of the people who would eventually be asked to vote on it. An admiral who had conducted an unauthorized solo mission in a personal vessel outside fleet jurisdiction was an admiral whose credibility in front of that vote was worth considerably less than it had been before the mission. This was the mathematics. Aldrich was waiting for exactly this kind of thing. She had known that when she made the decision. She had made it anyway because the intelligence was necessary and because she had calculated she could keep the mission quiet. The ship was the problem. A ship that damaged could not be serviced through normal channels without generating a maintenance record that would eventually reach someone who would ask why the fleet admiral's personal vessel had required emergency structural repair following a flight that was not in the traffic logs. Bay 9 had no assigned maintenance technician for the next 3 days. She had checked. The space behind partition C7 was logged as empty storage. She would figure out the next step after she had slept. She would allow herself 4 hours. She slept 4:03 and was at her desk by 5, which was early even for her, and began preparing for a briefing with Joint Command that she needed to get through without giving Warren Aldrich anything he could use. This was the shape of Admiral Serena Voss's morning on the day that Callum Mercer found her ship. Callum Mercer had been working the night cycle at Bay 9 for 2 years and 7 months. He had taken the assignment because it was available and because the solitude suited him in ways he had stopped trying to explain to people who asked. He was 44 years old, built for endurance rather than spectacle, with hands that bore the specific history of 2 decades of mechanical work, and a face that had settled into the stillness of someone who had learned to think before speaking and had been practicing long enough that the habit had become the character. He had been a propulsion systems technician in the Navy for 11 years. He had been, by every measurable metric his superiors had access to, exceptionally good at it. He had been discharged under the category that the Navy's personnel documentation described as failure to adhere to standardized operational procedures, which was accurate in the narrow sense that Callum had on multiple documented occasions deviated from standard procedure in order to achieve outcomes that standard procedure could not achieve. The outcomes had each time been better than the outcomes standard procedure would have produced. This had not, in the institutional calculus of the Navy's disciplinary framework, been the point. The point had been the deviation. Callum had understood this distinction and had disagreed with it and had continued to disagree with it at intervals that had eventually exhausted the patience of people whose patience was a professional requirement. He did not blame them for this. He understood institutions well enough to know that they were not designed to accommodate the kind of disagreement he was constitutionally incapable of not expressing. After the Navy, he had worked for 3 years at a commercial repair facility in the dockyards at Corpus Christi, then a posting to a mid-belt logistics platform, then a contract position aboard the Halcyon Maintenance Division Bay 9 night shift. He had not been planning on staying. That had been 2 years and 7 months ago, and he had not yet found a compelling reason to leave, which in his experience was how temporary arrangements became permanent ones. Bay 9 during the night shift was quiet in a way that suited him. The ships were mostly courier vessels and utility transports, with a few older scout models that had been retained past their operational date for reasons that had stopped being documented. He serviced them in rotation, working through his assignment list with the patience of someone who had made peace with work that was invisible until it stopped being done correctly. He had walked past the space behind partition C7 approximately 800 times. It was on his regular circuit through the bay's northern section, 3 nights after he had last walked past that space without incident, that something in his peripheral vision was wrong. He slowed. He looked. The ship was not in the standard fleet catalog. He knew the catalog the way a person who has worked around the same collection of vehicles for years knows them not through study, but through accumulated familiarity, the way a librarian knows the shelves without having read every book. This vessel was not on those shelves. It was sleek in a way that implied function rather than aesthetics, its lines suggesting speed with the economy of something designed by people who had not been trying to make a statement. The whole material had a quality in the dim maintenance lighting that he could not immediately categorize a subtle shift between dark silver and something deeper when the angle changed. Even damaged, it carried itself like something built without compromise. And it was damaged. The starboard NL bore stress fractures that ran in branching patterns deep enough that he could see from 3 meters away that the structural integrity was not a cosmetic problem. The port side had a collapsed housing along the lower section that he tentatively identified as he moved closer as the resonance coil assembly, though the configuration was unfamiliar enough that he spent several minutes studying it before he committed to the diagnosis. He checked his tablet for a work order attached to the bay's assignment system. There was nothing. He checked the bay manifest. The space behind partition C7 was logged as empty. Callum Mercer stood in the quiet of the hangar for a long moment and looked at the ship. Then he pulled the diagnostic stylus from his belt kit, pressed it against the hull near the nearest fracture to test the material response, and felt the small and familiar satisfaction of a problem presenting itself at exactly the moment he had nothing more urgent to do. He told himself he was just looking. This was something he told himself at the beginning of every project that subsequently occupied him for weeks. He started with the fractures because they were visible and because understanding the damage narrative of a vessel, how it broke in what sequence, under what conditions, was, in his opinion, the only honest way to understand what it needed. The fractures told him the ship had been pushed through an atmospheric transit at an angle and velocity it had not been engineered for. Not recklessly. More like deliberately under conditions where the alternative to the transit was something worse than the damage the transit would cause. The resonance coil told him the propulsion sequencing had developed a cascading misalignment before that. Not a failure, a series of choices, each one the best available option under progressively deteriorating circumstances. He could read it the way you read a scar. The scar told you more about the person than the wound did. By the third hour of the night cycle, Callum was sitting cross-legged on the hangar floor with 3 component schematics open on his tablet and a cooling cup of coffee beside him, and the expression of a man who had told himself he was only looking and had been conducting a detailed diagnostic assessment for 2 hours. He had not yet begun to wonder whose ship it was. 3 nights later, he returned with a fabrication kit. He told himself this was preliminary. He was going to assess the resonance coil housing more precisely and determine whether fabrication of a replacement bracket was feasible using components from the hangar's general stores. This was a fact-finding exercise and did not constitute a commitment to anything. He was by this point aware that he was not going to leave the ship alone. He had been aware of this since the second night. He had simply not announced it to himself in those terms, yet because that announcement would require him to confront the question of whose ship it was, and that question was going to complicate things, and the complication could wait until he had a better understanding of what the ship actually needed. The work required him to be creative about parts. The hangar's general stores contained equipment intended for standard fleet vessels, and this ship was not a standard fleet vessel. The material composition of the hull required a bonding compound that was not in stock, which meant he needed to formulate one from components that were. This occupied 3 evenings of work that he found genuinely absorbing in the way that problems requiring improvisation always absorbed him, not despite the constraints, but because of them. The constraint was the problem, and the problem was the point. He logged the components he used against a parts order he had submitted for a different bay's atmospheric regulator. He chose not to examine this decision in detail. It was in the 3rd week, reaching past the secondary access panel on the port side to get a better angle on the coil housing, that his elbow contacted a surface he had not previously identified as a control interface. The ship, which had until that moment been entirely cooperative in the manner of something inert, made a sound. The sound was low and purposeful, the way a large animal sounds when it decides to stop being unaware of you, and every exterior light on the hull came on simultaneously. The emergency illumination in the hangar had not been designed to compete with this and lost the competition immediately. Callum withdrew his arm. The defense grid sensor array deployed from recessed housings along the hull's upper section with the smooth efficiency of engineering that had been maintained even while everything else had been failing, and began sweeping the hangar in slow, methodical arcs. The sensors painted the floor and walls in the large storage container 3 meters to Callum's left in thin red lines, the way a careful reader marks important passages. He was behind the container in approximately the time it took him to decide that being behind the container was better than not being behind it. The grid swept. Callum sat with his back against the container and breathed at a rate he was making a deliberate effort to manage. The red lines moved across the wall above him with the patient attention of something that had nowhere else to be and no particular time pressure. He waited. He ate the protein bar from his left breast pocket. He read 2 chapters of a propulsion theory manual he had downloaded to his tablet. He may at some point have dozed briefly, which he preferred to attribute to professional composure rather than to the fact that he had been working night shifts for 2 years and 7 months, and his body had developed strong opinions about horizontal surfaces. He tried twice to approach the ship in the manner he associated with encounters requiring calm demonstration of non-threatening intent. The second attempt ended when the sensor array rotated toward him with a renewed focus that he interpreted as the system revising his status from background element to active point of interest. He returned to the container. At the 4-hour mark, the defense grid powered down with the same smooth efficiency with which it had deployed, apparently satisfied that whatever it had been designed to identify was not present in Bay 9. Callum emerged from behind the container and stood in the quiet hangar and looked at the ship for a long moment. He said to no one in particular that they were going to need to establish some ground rules. The ship said nothing. Callum decided this was agreement and went back to work. It was on his return the following night, while consulting a technical specification he had requested from the station's general engineering library, without specifying which vessel it was for, that he found it. He had needed to access a panel near the lower forward section to check a secondary coupling the diagnostic had flagged as borderline. The panel required a tool he had not brought the previous night, and opening it now exposed a section of the hull's interior he had not previously seen. The insignia was small and embedded rather than displayed, pressed into the interior surface of the panel housing in a way that suggested it was meant to be found only by someone who had already opened the panel for a legitimate reason. Fleet Admiral. Personal vessel. Restricted access. He looked at it for a while, long enough that the maintenance lighting in the bay completed its slow cycle and returned to the same point where it had begun. Then he closed the panel. He made a note in his log about the secondary coupling, borderline monitoring, no immediate action required. He gathered his tools. He sat down on the floor next to the cargo container and looked at the ship. The insignia meant the ship belonged to the highest-ranking officer in the Halcyon's fleet command structure. It meant that whatever had happened to this vessel had happened to an admiral. It meant that the absence of any work order, any maintenance log, any record of this ship's presence in Bay 9 was not an administrative oversight. It was a choice. Someone had parked this ship here specifically because they did not want it to be found. He thought about this with the same patience he brought to mechanical problems. He thought about the fracture patterns that told him the ship had been pushed through conditions it was not designed for. He thought about the coil damage that told him the pilot had faced a sequence of deteriorating options and had chosen the option that preserved the ship at the cost of everything else. He thought about the 4-hour defense grid deployment that had kept him behind a cargo container, eating a protein bar, which was beginning to feel less like an inconvenience and more like a piece of information. A fleet admiral's personal vessel, parked secretly, damaged in ways that told a story about extreme circumstances, registered nowhere. He picked up his diagnostic stylus. He set it back down. He picked it up again. The ship needed the resonance coil housing replaced. It needed the fractures addressed with a bonding compound he was now 2 evenings into formulating. It needed the power routing corrected because his initial assessment had identified a 17% thermal loss that was going to become a structural problem if the coil output was restored without first adjusting the routing. It needed, in his considered technical opinion, someone who knew what they were doing to spend several more weeks doing it. He was the only person in Bay 9. He told himself that whoever had parked this ship here had made a decision. He told himself he was not in a position to know what that decision had weighed. He told himself that working on a fleet admiral's personal vessel without authorization was a different category of professional risk than the categories he had navigated before. Then he looked at the fractured hull and the collapsed coil housing and the evidence written in damage of someone who had flown through something they had no good options for surviving. And he thought that whoever had flown this ship had not had good options and had made the best of the options available, and that the ship deserved to be made whole again, and that he was the person in front of it. He went back to work. The weeks that followed had the quality of absorbed time, the kind of hours that do not feel like duration while they are happening, because the problem is interesting enough to consume the foreground of attention entirely. He developed a working relationship with the ship that was not exactly trust and was not exactly caution, and was somewhere in the practical middle that develops between a skilled technician and a machine that has specific requirements and rewards exactness with performance. The resonance coil calibration occupied most of the third and fourth weeks. Standard fleet coils were calibrated to tolerances that prioritized stability across a wide operational range. The coil in this vessel had not been built to standard tolerance. It had been built tighter tuned to a narrower band that made it more efficient and more powerful and significantly less forgiving of drift. Whoever had designed it had understood the trade-off completely and had decided the performance was worth the maintenance discipline the design required. Callum respected this. He also found it extremely inconvenient because the calibration tools in Bay 9's standard kit were not precise enough for the tolerance range the coil required. He spent 2 evenings modifying a resonance alignment probe using components from a sensor array that was scheduled for decommissioning. He logged this against the same creative parts accounting system he had been developing since the beginning of the project, which had by this point accumulated enough internal complexity that he was maintaining a separate document to track it. The modified probe worked. Not elegantly, not in a way he would have wanted to present in a formal engineering review. But it worked in the specific sense that the numbers it produced were accurate, and when the coil was recalibrated to the tolerances the design required, it produced a tone in its housing that he could only describe as clarity, the sound of something that had been waiting to operate correctly and was now finally being allowed to do so. He had not intended to improve the output above specification. This was something that happened the way unintended consequences happen when a person keeps asking the next logical question. The calibration correction had revealed that the fractures were contributing a harmonic interference in the propulsion resonance. Addressing the harmonic interference had required revisiting the fracture repair and improving the match between the bonding compound and the hull material's specific composition. The improved fracture repair had made the NL geometry worth revisiting. Each correction revealed the next thing. The thread kept leading somewhere. At the end of the 5th week, sitting on the floor of Bay 9 with a calibration readout in one hand and a thoroughly cold cup of coffee in the other, Callum looked at what his tablet was telling him and sat with it for a moment. 22% above the vessel's original factory specification. He checked the calculation 3 times, which was habit rather than doubt, since he had known the first calculation was correct before he checked it. Then he leaned his head back against the cargo container. He had started thinking of it as his cargo container after the defense grid incident, which was the kind of possessiveness that develops between a person and the object that provided shelter during a difficult 40 minutes, and stared at the hangar ceiling. The ship was by any engineering measure he could apply significantly better than it had started. Somewhere in the back of his attention, not loudly, not urgently, but with the quiet persistence of a question that has been waiting in an orderly queue for several weeks and has finally reached the front, it occurred to him that whoever had parked this ship in Bay 9 had not parked it here to be improved. They had parked it here to be invisible. And a ship that was 22% above factory spec was a ship whose systems would report exactly that number when they ran their next automated diagnostic. He thought about this. He thought about the insignia behind the secondary access panel. He thought about the fracture patterns that told him someone had flown through conditions with no good options. He thought about the defense grid's patience, 4 hours of sweeping a hangar for a threat that wasn't there operating autonomously, protecting a ship that no one was officially watching. He thought about the admiral of a fleet who had parked her personal vessel in a secondary maintenance bay under no documentation in the middle of the night with damage that would require significant repair to make operational again. He thought that whoever she was, whatever she had been doing, whatever decision had led to a fleet admiral's personal vessel arriving here with those specific fractures in that collapsed coil housing, the decision had been made under conditions that did not offer good options. He knew how to read a scar. He returned the ship to the admiral's berth at 3 in the morning, 11 days later, guiding it through the secondary quarter on the docking thrusters in the deep quiet of the station's night cycle. The ship moved with a precision that made the docking approach almost effortless. The thrusters responded with the clean, immediate accuracy of systems that had been returned to their intended operational state and were performing accordingly. He felt in the silence of the empty corridor the uncomplicated satisfaction of a thing done properly. He walked back through the blue-gray corridors of the Halcyon's maintenance level to Bay 9, collected his tools, logged out of his shift, and walked to the service elevator without telling anyone anything. Behind partition C7, the space where the ship had been was empty. The cargo container was still there, positioned where he had left it during the defense grid incident, unremarkable and unmoved, an ordinary piece of storage furniture in an ordinary secondary maintenance bay. Callum Mercer went home. He ate something. He slept. And somewhere in the quiet processing of a mind that had spent 5 weeks on a single problem, another question was forming, not about the ship he had just returned, but about the principles underlying the coil design, the geometry of the calibration tolerances, the particular relationship between thermal loss and tolerance bandwidth that he had not fully resolved. He had not followed the thread to its end. He had simply arrived somewhere new. 2 levels above Bay 9 in the Halcyon's primary engineering monitoring center, a system running automated diagnostic sweeps of all vessels in the Admiral's berth, produced a status report at 0600 hours that it transmitted as it was programmed to do to the senior engineering officer on duty. Chief Engineer Vera Holt read the report. She read it again. Propulsion output exceeding baseline specification by 22%. All systems nominal. Structural integrity restored to full operational standard. She sat very still for a moment. Then she opened a private channel to Director Harlan Briggs and told him he needed to see something. Harlan Briggs read the diagnostic report standing up, which was how he read things he considered beneath his attention. He had cultivated this habit over the course of a 23-year career in station engineering administration, and it had become one of the small performances by which he communicated to the people around him that his time was organized into tiers and that the tier they were currently occupying was not the highest one. He finished reading. He sat down. Vera Holt watched him read it a second time from across his desk and said nothing. She had learned in 4 years of working under Briggs that the quality of his silences was informative. This one had the quality of a man revising his assumptions about what kind of morning he was having. He asked her how certain she was about the source. She told him she was certain. She had pulled the Bay 9 access logs for the past 6 weeks. One maintenance technician, night cycle consistent access to the partition C7 area on 31 separate shifts. No work orders filed, no parts requests under his personnel number, though there were parts requests under adjacent project codes that did not fully account for the materials involved. She had cross-referenced the fabrication logs and the calibration equipment checkout records. The modified resonance alignment probe had been checked out under a decommissioning project number for a sensor array that had not yet been decommissioned. His name was Callum Mercer, night shift Bay 9, 2 years, 7 months on the Halcyon, prior service Navy propulsion systems. Discharged under the procedural noncompliance classification. Briggs was quiet for a long moment. Outside his office, the engineering center's day shift was settling into its routines, the background noise of a large technical organization doing ordinary work. The contrast between that sound and the silence inside Briggs's office had a specific texture. Then he said something Vera had not been expecting. He told her not to report it. She looked at him. He told her to close the diagnostic report, flag the status entry as a routine systems fluctuation, and not to discuss what she had found with anyone outside this room. She asked him why. He told her he needed 24 hours to assess the situation properly before it went up the chain, which was a reasonable thing to say and was true in the narrow sense that he did need 24 hours, though the assessment he was planning had nothing to do with the chain of command in the direction Vera was imagining. Vera Holt was not a naive person. She had not reached the rank of chief engineer on a station the size of the Halcyon, by failing to understand what she was looking at. She looked at what she was looking at now for a moment. Then she said she understood and walked out of his office and did not look back. She told herself it was complicated. It was in fact complicated. But she also knew the difference between complicated and wrong. And she chose in the way that people in the middle of large hierarchies sometimes choose to let the complication do the work of obscuring the difference. Harlan Briggs waited until his door closed. Then he opened a private terminal connection and began thinking about what he had. What he had was significant. What he had was a maintenance technician with no formal credentials and no institutional standing who had operating alone with improvised tools and no resources beyond what he could quietly redirect from adjacent project accounts, solved a propulsion calibration problem that Briggs's own research division, properly funded, properly staffed, equipped with the best diagnostic systems the Halcyon's engineering budget could provide, had classified as theoretically unachievable 18 months ago. The research division's assessment had been the basis for a budget proposal that Briggs had submitted to Joint Command 6 months after that, requesting an expanded equipment allocation to pursue alternative approaches to the resonance calibration problem. The proposal had been approved. The allocation had been received. The alternative approaches were ongoing. 22% above factory specification. Achieved by a night shift maintenance worker with a modified probe and a parts accounting system, creative enough that it had taken Vera's detailed forensic review to reconstruct it. Briggs was not a man who lacked intelligence. He was a man whose intelligence had, over the course of a long career, been directed primarily toward the navigation of institutional structures rather than toward the solving of technical problems. And he understood institutional structures the way Callum Mercer understood propulsion systems, not through formal study, but through the accumulated fluency of someone who had spent decades inside one. He understood that what he was holding was not just a technical achievement. It was leverage. He opened a separate channel and composed a carefully worded message to General Warren Aldrich at Joint Command. He did not mention Callum Mercer by name. He did not describe the situation in full. He said that his division had achieved a significant breakthrough in outer belt propulsion efficiency research, and that he anticipated being able to share documentation in the next 72 hours, and that the breakthrough had implications that he believed General Aldrich would find relevant to the current strategic restructuring discussions. He sent the message. Then he opened a third channel and began drafting the documentation he would need to present the work as his division's own. He told himself that a maintenance technician who had operated without authorization for 6 weeks had no legitimate claim to recognition for work done on equipment he had no business touching. He told himself that the research division had been working toward this result and that Mercer's approach had simply arrived at the destination by a different route, and that the route was less important than the destination. He told himself that Mercer would face disciplinary exposure for the unauthorized access regardless, and that absorbing the work into official channels was in a certain light a form of consideration. He was good at telling himself things. He had been doing it for a long time. He did not think about Admiral Serena Voss at all, which was an oversight he would later have reason to regret. Serena Voss received the automated diagnostic notification at 0600 hours, read it at 0612 when she returned to her desk from a briefing preparation session, and sat with it for a while. The notification was generated by a system she had set up to monitor the status of her personal vessel during what she had categorized in her private planning documents as the current sensitive period. The system was designed to alert her if the vessel's status changed in any significant way. It had not been designed for the possibility that the change in status would be a comprehensive repair, because she had not considered that possibility when she set it up. She read the status summary. Structural integrity restored to full operational standard. Resonance coil recalibrated and operational. Propulsion output at 122% of factory baseline. She put the notification down. She picked it up. She read the propulsion figure again. 122%, not restored to baseline, exceeding baseline by 22%. She had told no one about the mission. She had told no one about the damage. She had told no one where she had parked the ship. The berth at Bay 9 was not in her official records. She had chosen it specifically because it was a maintenance facility that processed enough routine traffic that an additional vessel in a secondary partition would not trigger automated inventory flags if the entry was handled correctly. Someone had found the ship anyway. Someone had repaired it. Someone had not only restored every damaged system, but had improved the propulsion output to a figure that her own engineering division had documented 18 months ago as beyond the current theoretical ceiling for that class of resonance coil. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of her office and thought about this with the focused attention she applied to problems that required clear thinking precisely because the situation around them was not clear. The first question was not who. The first question was why. Someone who had found a fleet admiral's personal vessel parked without authorization in a secondary maintenance bay had two straightforward options. They could report the vessel to the appropriate administrative channel, which would generate an inquiry that would reach her desk with questions she was not prepared to answer. Or they could leave it alone and say nothing, which was the option that required nothing of them and expose them to nothing. They had taken a third option that required weeks of sustained effort, significant technical skill, and a creative approach to station resources that was at minimum administratively problematic. They had taken this option without being asked, without authorization, without any apparent expectation of recognition, and had done it to a standard that exceeded what her formerly resourced engineering division had been able to achieve. This was not the behavior of someone who had stumbled across an administrative inconvenience and handled it efficiently. This was the behavior of someone who had encountered a machine that needed to be fixed and had fixed it because the machine needed fixing. She pulled up the Bay 9 access logs. She spent 40 minutes working through them with the same attention she brought to intelligence assessments, cross-referencing access times with maintenance records and parts requisitions and calibration equipment checkouts. She built the timeline the way she built any tactical picture, one confirmed element at a time, no assumptions carried forward until supported. By the time she was done, she knew his name, his work history, his service record, and the broad outline of what he had done and how he had done it. Callum Mercer, night shift, Bay 9, discharged from Navy Propulsion System service under procedural noncompliance. 2 years, 7 months on the Halcyon Maintenance Division, no disciplinary record, no performance flags, no institutional visibility of any kind. She pulled his service record. The discharge documentation listed 4 separate incidents of procedural deviation, each one accompanied by an outcome assessment that noted the deviation had produced results superior to those achievable under standard procedure. The 4th incident had been accompanied by a note from his supervising officer that described Mercer as the most technically capable propulsion systems technician in the division and a persistent institutional problem, and recommended discharge on the grounds that the division could not afford to establish a precedent of rewarding noncompliance regardless of outcomes. She read this note twice. Then she pulled the research division's 18-month-old assessment of the resonance calibration ceiling. She read the methodology section. She looked at the Bay 9 calibration logs that Mercer had generated with a modified probe he had built from decommissioned sensor array components. She held the 2 documents in her mind at the same time and allowed herself one moment of something that was not quite humor and was not quite frustration, but occupied the territory between them. Her division had spent 18 months in a joint command budget allocation concluding that something was impossible. A maintenance technician on the night shift had spent 5 weeks making it happen with whatever he could find. She closed the files. She sat very still for a long time. General Aldrich had scheduled a command review for the following week. The restructuring proposal would be on the agenda. She had been preparing her response to it for 3 months, building the case for operational independence through performance metrics and strategic necessity documentation. It was a strong case. It was not a certain case. Aldrich had the votes if he chose to use them, and he was the kind of man who counted votes before he called them, which meant he only called them when the count was in his favor. What she had in front of her now was something different from a performance metric. What she had was evidence, not just of what Callum Mercer had done in Bay 9, but of what Briggs's division had not done with 18 months and a formal budget allocation. And if Briggs had received the diagnostic report, which the automated system would have routed to the senior engineering officer on duty, which at 0600 this morning had been Vera Holt, who reported to Briggs, then Briggs already knew about Mercer and had made some kind of decision about what to do with that information. She needed to know what decision he had made. She did not contact Briggs. She did not contact Vera Holt. She pulled Briggs's outgoing communications log through the command access she was entitled to as Fleet Admiral found the message sent to General Aldrich at 0731 that morning and read it. She read it twice. Her expression did not change. Then she opened her own planning document and began writing. On the other side of the station in the lower maintenance level, Callum Mercer was sleeping. He was sleeping with the quality of a man who has completed something he had been working on for weeks and whose mind for the first time in those weeks had no active thread to pull on and had therefore released its grip on consciousness more completely than usual. He was not at this point in the morning aware that two separate people in positions of significant authority had spent the past 3 hours reading about him. He became aware of the first of these people at 1600 hours when he reported for his shift and found a message waiting in his Bay 9 terminal. Not his station personnel account, but the terminal in the bay itself, which was unusual enough that he read it twice. The message was from Director Briggs's office. It did not identify itself as being from Briggs directly. It was routed through a departmental administrative account. It said that the engineering division had become aware of certain unauthorized modifications to station equipment and misappropriation of parts resources associated with the Bay 9 night shift, and that the individual responsible was advised to avoid any further activity related to these issues and to refrain from discussing the matter with colleagues or supervisors pending a formal administrative review. The language was carefully constructed to be threatening without being specific, which was the language of institutional power reminding someone of the distance between their position and the position of the person sending the message. Callum read it. He set it down. He read it again with the focused attention of someone extracting the precise content beneath the formal surface. What it told him, stripped of the administrative phrasing, was that someone who outranked him knew what he had done and had decided not to report it officially. The decision not to report it officially was by itself informative. If the appropriate response to unauthorized access to a fleet admiral's personal vessel was a formal investigation, the message would have been from the station's JAG office, not from an engineering division administrative account. The fact that it was not meant that whoever had sent it had a reason to keep the situation outside official channels. He thought about what that reason might be. He thought about the 22% figure that the automated diagnostic would have reported. He thought about the research division's budget allocation that Vera Holt had mentioned once in passing during a maintenance division briefing, an allocation for propulsion efficiency research that had been running for a year and a half. He thought about the specific language of the message: unauthorized modifications, misappropriation of parts resources. The language of someone establishing a liability framework, not resolving a problem. He understood with the same quiet precision with which he understood mechanical things that someone was planning to use what he had done in Bay 9 as a lever, and that the message he had just read was the first indication of where the lever was going to be applied. He was not frightened. He was not angry exactly. He was the way he got when a system had a problem that was more complicated than it had initially appeared, focused, patient, and interested in understanding the shape of the thing before he decided what to do about it. He filed the message, logged the start of his shift, and went to work. What he did not do through the 3 days that followed was contact Briggs, respond to the message, or discuss it with anyone. He worked his shifts. He maintained his assignment list. He serviced the courier vessels and utility transports with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. And in the quiet hours between tasks, he thought through what he knew and what he didn't know, and what the gap between those two things was likely to contain. On the morning of the third day after receiving the message, he arrived at the beginning of his shift to find the mandatory all-hands notice in his rotation queue. It was brief, formal, and written in the administrative register that the station's command hierarchy reserved for occasions when someone of significant authority wanted a specific thing to happen without explaining the full context. All technical division personnel, briefing hall 2, third hour of the day cycle, attendance mandatory. He read it twice. Then he sat on his cargo container, the container near partition C7, the one he had sat behind for 40 minutes, while a defense grid decided what category of threat he belonged to, and thought about the notice with the focus of someone assembling a picture from pieces that had not yet fully declared themselves. He thought about the ship. He thought about the insignia. He thought about the automated diagnostic report and the message from Briggs's office, and the timing of a mandatory all-hands notice arriving 3 days after someone senior had tried to buy his silence with implied consequences. He thought about the fleet admiral whose ship had been parked in a secondary maintenance bay with damage that told a story about someone flying through conditions with no good options. He thought about what it meant that the ship had been parked with no documentation, no maintenance order, no official record of its presence, and what it meant that the same admiral would now know the ship had been repaired by someone because the automated diagnostic would have reached her just as it had reached everyone else. He thought about all of this. He thought about it for a long time. And when he was done thinking, the picture had assembled itself into something he recognized. And what he recognized was not a situation that could be navigated by staying quiet. It could not be navigated by staying quiet because someone else had already decided it wasn't going to stay quiet. The all-hands notice was not a routine briefing. It was the moment when the thing that had been in shadow was going to be brought into light, and the only question remaining was what shape it was going to take when it got there. He thought about Briggs standing in front of a briefing hall full of technical personnel and claiming credit for work he hadn't done. He thought about that for a while. He ate dinner. He tried to read. The reading did not hold his attention. On the day of the briefing, he put on his maintenance division uniform, the same one he wore every shift. Nothing distinctive beyond the division patch and his name, and took the service elevator to the command level. Briefing Hall 2 was a large formal space. The maintenance division was not regularly invited to tiered seating descending toward a central platform in the architectural style that communicated authority without announcing it too loudly. He found a position near the back of the maintenance section in the upper tier, where the lower-ranking technical personnel had arranged themselves with the spatial instinct of people who have learned that proximity to decision-making carries both information and exposure, and have made a calculated judgment about the ratio. The senior engineers were already in the front rows. Briggs was among them, positioned with the careful deliberateness of someone who had thought about where to stand. Vera Holt was at the end of the front row, her posture composed, her attention directed at the platform. They were not talking to each other. In Callum's observations, senior engineers on the Halcyon were a conversational group by default inclined to discussing technical matters loudly enough to be heard by junior staff. The current silence was different. It had the quality of people who shared a piece of information they had collectively decided not to surface and were managing their relationship with that decision in public. He was still thinking about this when Admiral Serena Voss walked onto the platform. The hall came to attention with the immediate unified motion of bodies responding to something they recognized before their conscious minds processed the instruction. Callum came to attention with everyone else, and in the moment before his training took over and replaced individual observation with the physical formality of military posture, he had time to register her. She was in working dress rather than formal uniform, the dark operational attire of Fleet Command without ceremonial insignia. Only the small designation at the collar had identified her rank to someone who knew the notation. She wore it with the quality of someone who had not put it on to be looked at. Her dark hair was pulled back with practical severity. She was exactly 48 years old, and she carried those years the way people carry things they have chosen rather than things that have happened to them. She told the hall to stand easy and waited through the reorganization that followed with the patience of someone for whom waiting was a professional instrument. Then she spoke. She described the damage her vessel had sustained. She used precise technical language, fracture patterns, structural integrity percentages, specific system failures in the tone of someone who knew exactly what they were describing and wanted that clearly understood. She described what the vessel had been assessed as requiring. She described what it had been found to contain upon its return to the Admiral's berth. Every repair completed, every system restored, the resonance coil recalibrated and performing at 22% above factory baseline. Her voice throughout this was level and without emphasis. In the absence of emphasis was more attentive-making than emphasis would have been. It left no space for the listener to decide what to focus on. Everything she said carried the same weight. The listener had to hold all of it. She asked who was responsible. The silence that followed was absolute in the way that silences are absolute when they are not accidental, when a room full of people has, in the space of a moment, made a collective decision to produce one. Callum looked at the front rows. Briggs had shifted his weight slightly, a preparation, a man gathering himself for a performance. His timing was careful. He was going to let the silence build until it reached the point where someone filling it would appear to be rescuing the room rather than seizing the moment. It was the move of someone who had thought this through. Voss waited. She waited with the quality of someone for whom patience was not the absence of action, but a form of it, a pressure applied steadily without fluctuation until something gave way. She asked again. Same words, same tone, same level of tension moving across the assembled ranks like a sensor sweep. Callum looked at Briggs. He watched the man's weight shift again, the preparation completing itself into something that was about to become motion. He thought about the message from the administrative account. He thought about the diagnostic report being redirected. He thought about what it meant to claim credit for work you hadn't done in front of the person whose ship the work had been done on. He thought about a woman flying through conditions with no good options alone in a ship that should not have survived what she put it through, parking it in a maintenance bay in the middle of the night with no documentation and trusting not anyone specifically, but trusting that a broken thing in a maintenance bay would eventually encounter someone whose instinct was to fix it. He thought about what he owed that. He stepped forward. It was one step out of the back rank of the maintenance section. Not dramatic, not staged. One step that separated him from the formation by a distance that everyone in the hall could measure, and that was very loud in the way that small movements become loud when they happen inside a large silence. He heard Briggs stop moving. He said in a voice he kept as level as he could manage that he was responsible. He said he had found the ship in Bay 9 with no work order attached and no identifying documentation in the Bay manifest. He said he had worked on it during off hours because it appeared to need attention and he had the time and the capability. He said that he had not known when he began whose vessel it was, and he said he was sorry for the unauthorized access. The second silence, the one that followed this, was a different thing from the first entirely. The first had been held in place by conscious effort maintained by a room full of people managing their relationship with something they knew. This one arrived on its own without anyone deciding to make it produced by a room that had been surprised into it. He was aware of Admiral Voss's attention finding him in the back tier, the way a directed beam finds a specific point, not searching because she had not appeared to need to search. She regarded him for a moment that lasted longer from the inside than it probably did from the outside. Then she said the assembly was dismissed, and she said that Callum Mercer should remain. The room emptied with the efficiency of people who had somewhere specific to be and a strong personal interest in arriving there immediately. It did not empty all at once. It emptied the way large spaces empty when the authority that filled them withdraws its pressure. First the outer edges, then the middle tiers, the movement toward the exits, developing its own momentum until the sound of footsteps on the tiered floor became a continuous low percussion that lasted approximately 90 seconds and then stopped. Callum watched it happen from the back of the maintenance section, from the single step forward that separated him from the place he had been standing and did not move. Briggs left with the front rows. He did not look back. He walked toward the east exit with the measured pace of a man who had decided that his best available option was to look like a man who had somewhere to be and had chosen to be there, and Callum watched him go with the attention of someone cataloging something they weren't sure yet how to file. The man had prepared a performance for this room. He had rehearsed it. He had calculated the timing with the precision of someone who understood exactly how institutional theater worked and where in its rhythms a prepared actor had the most leverage. He had not been prepared for someone to step forward before his cue. Vera Holt left the front row last after the senior engineers had already gone. She walked toward the exit with her spine straight and her attention directed forward, and she did not look back either, and there was something in that choice and the quality of not looking back that told Callum more than looking back would have. She knew. She had known since she had filed the diagnostic report. She had made a calculation, and the calculation had led her somewhere, and now she was carrying that somewhere through the east exit with her posture composed and her silence intact. He did not judge it. He understood the mathematics of middle positions and tall hierarchies. He had lived at the bottom of enough of them to know what the middle looked like from below. The door closed, the hall was empty except for two people, and the quality of air that large spaces acquire when they have held hundreds of bodies and are suddenly holding only a few. It was a different kind of quiet from the quiet of Bay 9, not the quiet of a space that had never been full, but the quiet of a space that remembered being full and had not yet recalibrated. Admiral Voss descended from the platform. She moved with the economy of someone who had learned a long time ago that the way you crossed a room told people things and had decided to tell them as little as possible. She reached the main floor and stood at the base of the tiered seating with her hands clasped behind her back and looked up at Callum with the same level of attention she had directed at the full assembly, except that now it was not distributed across 500 people. It was directed at one. He began making his way down. The first three tiers presented no difficulty. He had worked on uneven surfaces for 20 years, and his body knew how to navigate them without conscious direction. The fourth tier had a slightly raised edge, where the flooring material had separated from its mounting, a maintenance issue he noted automatically that would need to be addressed before someone less accustomed to uneven surfaces encountered it. And he caught it with the front of his boot and caught himself on the row railing with the reflexive efficiency of someone whose recovery instincts had been developed through long practice in place of elegance. He straightened. Voss, who had observed this from the floor level, said nothing. Her expression did not change in any way he could identify as reactive. He decided to treat this as generosity and continued down the remaining tiers without further incident. He stopped at a distance that seemed appropriate, close enough for conversation, far enough to communicate that he understood the space between their respective positions in the station's hierarchy and was not planning to pretend otherwise. She studied him for a moment with the thoroughness of someone who collected accurate information as a professional discipline and applied that discipline consistently regardless of context. Then she said she wanted to understand his methods. She gestured toward the small anteroom off the hall's east wall and walked toward it with the clear expectation that he would follow. He followed. The anteroom was plain and functional in the way of spaces that existed to serve a purpose rather than to make an impression. A table, several chairs, a wall display running the station's operational status in quietly scrolling data that nobody was currently reading. A single window that looked out onto the inner corridor rather than into open space, which Callum found fitting for a room in which a maintenance technician was about to explain himself to a fleet admiral. She sat. He sat across from her with the careful posture of someone who had not done this before and was compensating by being deliberate about his spine. She began with the resonance coil. She asked him in precise technical language, not the approximate language of someone establishing familiarity with a subject, but the exact language of someone who had spent time this morning reviewing the specific documentation, how he had arrived at the calibration solution he had used. He explained. He kept his language careful at first, aware of the distance between the vocabulary he used when he was thinking out loud in an empty hangar and the formal engineering terminology that station technical staff used in official contexts. But she asked follow-up questions that were specific enough to reveal she understood exactly what he was describing. Not approximately, exactly. She asked about the tolerance band he had targeted and why he had chosen that band rather than the standard specification. And when he explained that the standard specification was optimized for stability at the cost of performance, and that the coil had clearly been designed by someone who had made the opposite trade-off, she asked how he had identified that from the damaged housing. Somewhere in the middle of explaining how the coil's material stress patterns indicated its designed operational range, he forgot to be careful and started talking the way he talked to himself in the hangar, directly with the shorthand of someone thinking through a problem, rather than presenting conclusions, occasionally using his hands to indicate geometries that were easier to show than describe. She listened without interrupting. When he reached the part about the power routing inefficiency, the 17% thermal loss that was a bleeding output to heat rather than converting it to thrust, something in her expression shifted by a small but perceptible amount. Not surprise. More the quality of attention that sharpens when information arrives that is more interesting than anticipated. He had seen that expression in engineers who cared deeply about the work. He had not expected to see it here at this table directed at him. He explained the molecular bonding compound he had formulated himself. She asked for the proportions and he gave them, and she was quiet for a moment afterward, in the way of someone running a calculation to verify whether a result is theoretically sound. He explained the NL geometry revision. She asked why he had adjusted the angle by the specific increment he had chosen. He said honestly that it had looked wrong to him, that there was an asymmetry in the original geometry that his eye registered as inconsistent with the rest of the design's logic, and that he had kept adjusting it until it looked right and then run the numbers to check, and the numbers had agreed with his eye. She regarded him steadily after this. He said he understood that was not a formal methodology. She said she was aware of what it was and asked him to continue. He told her about the defense grid incident. He told it the way he told things that had happened accurately, without decoration, with the economy of someone who has long since stopped needing an incident to reflect well on them in order to report it truthfully. He described the 40 minutes behind the cargo container. He described the 2 attempts to approach the ship using the body language he associated with non-threatening encounters. He described the protein bar in the 2 chapters of propulsion theory and the possibility that he had briefly dozed, which he attributed to his shift schedule, rather than to any failure of professional composure, though he acknowledged the distinction was arguable. Something happened in the vicinity of her eyes that he would not have been confident calling a smile, but that shared certain structural characteristics with one. She asked him why he had stepped forward. He had known the question was coming. He had felt it waiting in the conversation since the moment the hall had begun to empty, not as a threat, but as the weight of something that deserved an honest answer rather than a useful one. He took a moment with it because it deserved a moment, and because he had learned a long time ago that the difference between an answer given quickly and an answer given correctly was usually worth the pause. He said that she had asked. He said the true answer to a direct question was not something he had ever found a good reason to withhold, regardless of whether the withholding was more convenient. He said he understood why other people in that room had made a different calculation. He understood the mathematics of it. He had spent enough years at the bottom of institutional hierarchies to understand what the calculation looked like from the middle, and he was not in a position to judge people for making it. But it was not a calculation he knew how to make for himself. He had tried in the Navy, and the trying had not lasted. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the anteroom's interior window, the station's corridor carried its ordinary traffic personnel in transit, the background motion of a large organism sustaining itself. The Halcyon's hum moved through the floor beneath the table, low and continuous, the pulse of something that had been keeping itself alive for 9 years at the edge of the Brennan Belt. Voss said that 3 of her senior technical staff had identified him as the likely source of the repairs before the briefing. She did not specify how. She said they had chosen individually and without apparent coordination not to bring this information forward. She said this without heat, without judgment, in the tone of someone describing a fact they had already fully processed and filed and were presenting now as context rather than as grievance. Callum thought about Vera Holt's straight spine walking toward the exit. He thought about Briggs's carefully calculated timing. He said he thought it was probably a complicated position to be in, knowing something in the middle of a large hierarchy, with pressure coming from above and exposure coming from below, and having to make a decision about which direction the cost was going to travel. Voss looked at him with an attention that was different from what she had brought to the technical questions. More considered, less linear. The way you look at something when you are not only assessing what it is, but what it means. She said that was a generous interpretation. He said he had worked at the bottom of large hierarchies for long enough to understand that people in the middle of them made calculations that looked different from the outside than they did from where the person was standing. He said this not as a defense of what had happened, but because it was true, and he had already established his position on true things. She was quiet again. Then she told him something that reordered the past 48 hours of his thinking in approximately the time it took her to say it. She said she had identified him as the source of the repairs on the 42nd day after her vessel had been moved to Bay 9. She had pulled the access logs, cross-referenced the parts requisitions, reconstructed the timeline. She had known his name, his service history, and the broad outline of what he had done and how he had done it 3 days before the mandatory all-hands notice went out. She had known before she walked onto that platform. He sat with this. She said the briefing this morning was not an investigation. It had never been an investigation. She had not assembled 500 technical personnel in Briefing Hall 2 to find out something she already knew. She said it was a test, not of him specifically, of the organization, of the people in it at every level, in every tier of the hierarchy she was responsible for commanding. She had wanted to know who would step forward and who would stay back, who would claim what did not belong to them, who would protect themselves at the cost of someone else, and who, when the question was asked directly, and the cost of answering it honestly was visible to everyone in the room, would tell the truth anyway. She said she had needed to know these things because she was about to have a significant conversation with Joint Command, and the conversation required her to know what she was standing on. He understood what she meant without her elaborating. He thought about Briggs's message to General Aldrich. He didn't know the specific content, but he understood the shape of what a man like Briggs would do when he saw an opportunity in an institutional moment. He thought about the restructuring proposal that station personnel talked about in the careful, sideways language people use for things that frighten them. He thought about what it meant that Briggs had tried to buy his silence before the briefing, rather than after, which meant Briggs had wanted the morning's outcome to be something other than what it had become. He said he understood. She said she thought he did. She told him that Director Harlan Briggs had sent a communication to General Aldrich at Joint Command the same morning the diagnostic report was filed, the same morning she had received it. He had moved quickly. She had moved faster. In that message, Briggs had represented work done in Bay 9 as the output of the station's engineering research division and had offered to share documentation in exchange for Aldrich's continued support of the restructuring proposal. She said she had intercepted this communication through the command access available to her as Fleet Admiral. She said she now had, in addition to the technical documentation from Bay 9, a record of a senior station officer using fabricated research credit to conduct unauthorized negotiations with a Joint Command General over the command structure of a fleet he did not command. She said this record had been transmitted to the station's Judge Advocate General Office at 0400 that morning. She said Aldrich's restructuring proposal would not be advancing to a vote. She said this in the same tone she had used for everything else, level precise without performance, as if she were reporting the operational status of a system that had just completed its function. Callum sat with all of this for a moment. He thought about the ship in Bay 9. He thought about the insignia behind the secondary panel and the damage patterns that had told him a story about someone flying through conditions with no good choices. He thought about 5 weeks of night shifts in a modified probe and a parts accounting system that had become complex enough to require its own documentation. He thought about a cargo container and 40 minutes in a protein bar and the sound a defense grid makes when it decides to take you seriously. He thought about the fact that none of it had been visible to anyone while it was happening, and that visibility had never been the point. He said it quietly. He said he was glad the ship was flying. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not the composed neutrality she had maintained through the technical questions or the deliberate levelness she had used when she described Briggs and Aldrich. It was something he didn't have a precise name for, the expression of someone who has been doing a very demanding job for a very long time and has just encountered something that was worth the difficulty. She said there was something she wanted to tell him. She said that when she had been preparing for the mission that had damaged her vessel, she had run the probability assessments herself. The routing she had chosen, the approach that would get her to the intelligence window in the time available, required her to push the ship through a re-entry profile that her own calculations placed outside the safe operational envelope. She had known this before she flew it. She had flown it anyway because the intelligence was necessary and because the window was the window. She said the ship had done what she had asked it to do. It had held together through something it had not been designed for, and it had gotten her home, and she had parked it in Bay 9 because it was the best available option at the time, and she had needed to make the next decision before she could think about the previous one. She said she had not expected anyone to find it. She had not expected, if someone found it, that they would do what he had done. She had not expected, given everything she now knew about what he had done, that the result would be what the diagnostic had reported. She said she wanted him to know that the propulsion upgrade he had achieved, the 22% above baseline, was not a minor technical improvement. She had run the operational projections. Applied across the fleet's patrol vessels, a propulsion efficiency increase of that magnitude extended the sustainable patrol radius without resupply by 38%. In practical terms, it meant the outer belt could be maintained with the current fleet complement rather than the expanded complement that Aldrich's restructuring had claimed was operationally necessary. She said that Aldrich's argument for restructuring had rested partly on a resource efficiency case that centralized command would allow better allocation of a fleet that was, he had claimed, operating at the edge of its sustainable range. She said that argument was no longer available to him. She said this without emphasis, letting it settle at its own weight. Callum thought about this, about the thread that had started with a fracture pattern on a hull he had no business examining, and where it had led. He thought about the way threads worked, how they kept leading somewhere new if you followed them, how you couldn't always see where you were going until you arrived. He said he hadn't been trying to do any of that. She said she knew. She said that was part of what she wanted to discuss. She told him she was authorizing his transfer to the station's propulsion research division, effective at the start of the next duty cycle. She said it in the same tone she had used for everything else. Not as a reward, not as a ceremony, as a fact she was placing in the record. She said the division worked on propulsion systems and related engineering problems, and that his approach to the resonance calibration issue in particular had produced a result that her formally credentialed research team had not achieved in 18 months with a joint command budget allocation and access to the best diagnostic equipment on the station. She said this without emphasis, which made it land with more weight than emphasis would have carried. He said he appreciated it. He said he wanted to be honest that his methods were not always reproducible in the way that formal research documentation required. He said he could not always explain why a thing looked wrong to him before he ran the numbers. He only knew that it did, and that the numbers had generally agreed with his eyes when he checked them. She said the research division's documentation standards were not her most pressing concern regarding his transfer. She said she expected he would manage. He said he would try. She said that wasn't what she had said. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said he would manage. Something moved in her expression, brief, controlled, in the vicinity of what might have been satisfaction in a person who expressed it more readily. She stood, which was the signal that the meeting was concluding, and he stood also, and for a moment they were both upright on either side of the plain functional table in the plain functional anteroom, and the station hummed around them with its low continuous presence, and there was nothing else that needed to be said. He thanked her. He turned toward the door. He discovered, with the philosophical acceptance of a man who had made his peace with the universe's preference for comic timing, that his boot had at some point during the preceding conversation hooked itself under the base of the chair leg, and that his first step toward the door was therefore not going to be the step he had intended it to be. He caught himself on the doorframe. He did not look back. He straightened, released the doorframe, and walked out into the corridor with the steady pace of a man going somewhere. Behind him in the anteroom and off briefing hall, two Admiral Serena Voss stood alone at the table for a moment. The expression she had been maintaining since she had walked onto the platform, the composed, level-controlled expression of a commanding officer conducting a necessary institutional action, had been in place for several hours. It had done its work. It had held through the briefing and through the silence and through the moment when a maintenance technician from the night shift had stepped forward out of the back rank and changed the shape of the morning. It had held through the technical conversation and through the questions and through everything she had needed to say about Briggs and Aldrich and what came next. It was done now. She allowed it to be done. She sat back down at the table and looked at the wall display, still running the station's operational status and its patient scrolling data, and she let herself think about all of it at once rather than in the managed sequence she had been maintaining. She thought about the mission, about the routing calculations she had run in the hours before departure, the probability assessments, the specific numbers she had assigned to the likelihood that the ship would survive what she was going to ask it to do. The number had been acceptable by her standards. It had not been comfortable. She had flown it anyway because the work required it, and because the work was what it was, and because there was nobody else available to do it. She thought about parking the ship in Bay 9 in the dark, with her hands steadier than they had wanted to be. About taking the service elevator to the command level and walking the corridor at an ordinary pace, because walking corridors at ordinary paces was something people did and did not notice. About sitting at her desk in the dark afterward and working through the mathematics of her situation with the focused attention she applied to problems that required clear thinking precisely because the clarity around them was not available. She thought about what it meant that a man she had never spoken to had found her ship and spent 5 weeks fixing it because it needed to be fixed, not because he knew whose it was, not because there was a reward available, not because anyone would ever know absent the automated diagnostic that neither of them had anticipated, because the ship was broken and he was there and he knew how to fix it. She thought about the service records she had read. 4 disciplinary incidents, each one noting that the deviation had produced superior results. The final note from his supervising officer most technically capable in the division. Persistent institutional problem. Recommended discharge on the grounds that the division could not afford to establish a precedent. She had read that note and understood it. She had been on the other side of that calculation herself at an earlier point in her career, understood the institutional logic, understood why the officer had written what he had written. Institutions survived by establishing precedents, and they were not wrong to protect that function. But the note had been written about Callum Mercer, and Callum Mercer had subsequently spent 2 years and 7 months on the night shift at a secondary maintenance bay on the Halcyon servicing courier vessels and utility transports in the quiet hours when nobody was watching, and had produced in his private inventory of the universe's problems that needed to be addressed a propulsion solution that changed the operational calculus of her entire fleet. She thought about what the Halcyon's institutional processes would have produced if left to their own devices. She thought about Briggs's division and their 18 months and their budget allocation and their conclusion that the problem was theoretically unachievable. She thought about what it meant that the answer had been sitting in Bay 9 on the night shift for 2 years and 7 months, and nobody had known to look for it because the system that was supposed to find answers had been organized around different priorities. She thought about Vera Holt. Holt was a good engineer, a competent chief. She had understood what she was looking at in Briggs's office and had chosen in the space of a moment to let someone else decide what it meant. That choice had a cost. Institutions that did not apply cost to choices like that one eventually found that the choices became more frequent, and the people making them became more comfortable making them, and the institution quietly became something other than what it had been designed to be. The formal letter of reprimand to Chief Engineer Vera Holt had already been drafted. It would be delivered before end-of-duty cycle. The letter would not change who Holt was. It would, however, change the record, and the record was how institutions remembered what had happened when the room was full and what choices people had made and whether those choices had cost them anything at all. Now she stood straight in her uniform and walked to her desk in the command office rather than back toward the corridor. She had work to do, and she preferred to do it standing in the room where the decisions had weight. The first call she made was to the JAG office to confirm receipt of the Briggs documentation. The second was to Joint Command, not to Aldrich, but to the review board chairperson, a woman she had served alongside 20 years ago on a posting neither of them liked to remember, and both of them had learned from. She kept the call brief. She stated the facts in the order that made their implications clear. She let the facts do what facts do when they are arranged correctly. The third thing she did was pull up the Propulsion Research Division's current project roster on her terminal. She scrolled to the personnel section. She added one name. Then she closed the terminal, stood at the window of her command office, and looked out at the Brennan Belt, the dense field of rock and ice and dark matter that the Halcyon had been watching for 9 years. The edge of things, the place past which the charts became provisional, and the decisions became the kind that did not have good options. She had chosen this post. She had chosen it specifically because it was the edge, because the work that mattered most happened at edges, because the people who were willing to operate at the boundary between what was known and what wasn't were the people worth commanding. She had spent 3 months preparing a case for Joint Command built on performance metrics and strategic documentation. It was a strong case. It had not been a certain case. What had made it certain was a cargo container and a protein bar and a maintenance technician who could not walk past a broken thing. She stood at the window for exactly as long as it took her to remember fully and without reservation why she had chosen this post, this command, this particular edge of things. Then she turned back to her desk and began the work. 2 levels below in Bay 9, the night cycle was still hours away. The maintenance lighting ran at its reduced setting, cool and functional, painting the storage containers and the service equipment and the empty berths in the blue-gray that indicated unoccupied space. Behind partition C7, the space that had held a fleet admiral's personal vessel for 5 weeks was empty and had been empty for 11 days. The cargo container was still there, positioned where Callum Mercer had left it after the defense grid had decided he was not a threat and released him from that particular consideration. It sat in the quiet hangar with the unremarkable presence of objects that exist in spaces where nobody is currently looking. It would remain there for some time. Eventually, someone would file a reorganization order for the bay's storage configuration, and a crew would come through and move everything to its designated location, and the container would end up wherever the manifest said it belonged. But for now, it was here. The best seat in an empty room, in a secondary maintenance bay on a station at the edge of the Brennan Belt, where something had been done that the people with the resources and the credentials and the formal mandate to do it had concluded was impossible. Callum Mercer walked back through the Halcyon's corridors toward the maintenance level, his hands in his pockets, his mind already moving into territory he had not yet charted. Not the ship was done, returned, accounted for, its story told. Not the briefing, not the anteroom, not the conversation at the table. Those things had happened, and he had said what was true, and the rest of it had resolved the way things resolved when you stopped trying to manage them and simply told the truth and let the truth do its work. What his mind was moving toward was the problem he had not finished. There was a relationship between the coil's tolerance band and the thermal management requirements of the routing system that he had identified in the fourth week and had not had time to fully develop before the project ended. He had resolved enough of it to get the output to 22% above baseline. He had not resolved all of it. The full resolution, if there was a full resolution, and he believed there was, because the architecture of the problem had the internal consistency of something that had an answer, would require him to think about the heat dissipation geometry differently than he had been thinking about it. He had an idea about how to think about it differently. The idea had arrived the way ideas arrive for him, not as a conclusion, but as a direction, a sense that if he looked at the problem from a specific angle, he had not yet tried, something would become visible that was not visible from the angles he had already used. He did not know what he would find when he looked. He took the service elevator down to the maintenance level. The corridor was blue-gray and quiet, the station breathing its low, continuous hum around him, 53,000 people, and the machinery that kept them alive, carrying everyone forward into whatever came next. He walked with the steady pace of a man who knew where he was going and had already begun going there. In the Propulsion Research Division, one level above where he was walking, a roster had just been updated. His name was on it now, in the system attached to a division with resources and equipment and colleagues who had been working on problems adjacent to the one he had just solved. He would be there tomorrow. Tonight he had a shift to finish and a direction to think in the particular silent company of a station that hummed its continuous note. Through everything, it held steadily at the edge of the known, carrying the work forward.